Hello and welcome back to the pinescript bootcamp. This is going to be a new indicator that we're talking about in this section. And this indicator is going to be designed for a slightly different market condition than the previous two. Whereas the RSI and the moving average cloud were both intended to capture directional moves, either up or down, either waiting for the trend or the direction to be established and then jumping on board with it, or trying to front run it a little bit and then hop on before it makes that turn and moving down. So those are market conditions that can be very profitable when you're using those two particular styles of trading. However, they can be very unprofitable when you enter a different market condition where the price action is more choppy, where it's going back and forth, up and down, and up and down, and up and down. It's not picking direction. It's not breaking out of any particular range. So in those conditions, it's better to use something else, and something like the grid level system. So the grid level system basically takes a baseline price, we'll call it like the anchor price, and then it draws equidistant lines above and below that price where you will buy or sell. So essentially every time that price moves up or down by a certain amount, you are either entering or exiting a position. So say this is our anchor price, price comes up here, and we are expecting, because this is designed for a choppy market, we're expecting that eventually price is going to come back down. So you would buy here and then sell down here, or you would buy here and then sell here. And more specifically, you are buying at every level, or you are selling rather, as it goes up, you're selling at each of these levels. And then as price comes back down, you are buying it back. So when price moves up and then down, every time it's crossing a line, you're making money. So if price bounces back and forth in between these two lines several times, you're making quite a bit of money, because you're buying here, selling here, or you're selling here and then buying here. And so you bounce around quite a bit. Same thing happens on the sell side. If price comes down, you buy it here and then you sell it back here. Buy it here, sell it here. So this is the way that the grid system works. It works really well in a range-bound or choppy or sideways market, however you want to think of it. So that's the idea that we're going to be working on for this indicator. So now that we have an idea of how this is intended to work, let's go ahead and dive into the script and get started. As usual, we need to initialize our script. So in this case, we do have a new indicator, and we are going to call this the grid levels. And this one, again, we do want to overlay this on top of the bars themselves. We don't want it in a separate panel, so we're going to specify that we want the overlay to be true. Then we will set up our structure. So as usual, we have our declarations section at the top. Then we have our user inputs. Then we have custom types, custom methods, core logic. Oh, sorry, I always do this, don't I? Our variables, rather. Then our core logic, then our visuals. So let's go ahead and save our script. Save it as grid levels. We'll add it to the chart so we can take a look. It is on the chart, it's working properly, and it is plotting just the closing price. All right, we're ready to get started. All right, so the first thing that we need to do in this script is to kind of determine we need to specify the time horizon that we're going to be using this. Right? We don't want this to be ongoing like we do with the RSI or the moving average cloud, right? Because the market can bounce around between different levels, and eventually the market is going to drift away from whichever range that we specify. So this does have kind of a expiration date, right? The range or the grid that we're going to set up. So we want to be able to first of all specify when we're looking to trade this range. So we'll start up here with a user input, and what we're going to need to specify is a time, right? A session is what pinescript calls it. So this is saved as a string, and we're going to call this the window, the trading window, right? Windows open and they close, and they can do this every day. So I like to use the term window to refer to this time. So we're going to put input and session, and you'll notice here, right, that session is a string. So let me just double check. Yep, constant string, right? So this is not a series. This is just one value that is set, and it doesn't change unless the user changes it. So this does not update with every bar. This is just always the same value. So we set our default value, and because it's a string, we need to use quotation marks when we put this in. It's a little bit weird, but that is how it works. So our default value, let's think of the range that we want to trade. We'll just go with like a regular trading hours day, which starts at 9:30 and goes to 1600. So you do need to use this 24-hour format, and it does need to be exactly like this. So you do need the hyphen in the middle, and then you will give it a title so that the user knows what they're putting in. So this is a window, and then just to show you what that looks like, we'll update on the chart and take a look. So when you click on the settings, you'll see it says window, and you have kind of a time drop down. You can also type in, you don't have to use any of these preset values. You can type in something like 1603 if you wanted to, right? So we just default to 1600, and that gives us at least our user input for the window. So started off strong. Now we have the user input for the window, we have a default value for it, and now we need to find a way to decide whether we're inside of that window or not. And so what we're going to need is another variable. This one is going to be a bool, and we're going to call this bool in window, right? So this tells us whether in window is true or false. Are we in the window or are we not? We're going to default this to false, and this is a series bool, so it is going to default back to false every single bar, and the only way that it'll ever be true is if we change it to true. And how do we do that? We're going to need to use some core logic here. So we are going to need a conditional statement, right? We're only going to turn this bool in window to be true under a certain condition. So we need to specify what that condition is. So we're going to say if, and then we're going to use a new function called time, and this basically tests to see if something, or it tests basically to see what time it is on the current bar. So it's going to return back a Unix time unless we're not inside of the session, right? And then in which case it returns NA, right? Not a number. So we'll start with the time frame, and the time frame is basically you can specify 5-minute, 60-minute, whatever, right? Or you can pass an empty string, and then in which case it just interprets whatever the chart's time frame is. It can detect that, and it just uses that. So that's what we want to do. We don't want to hard code in any time frame. We want to make sure that it just goes off of whatever the chart is. So we have our time frame. Then our session, of course, we already have created our session up here with the user input, so we're just going to pass in the window variable, and then it's asking for bars back. However, we don't really care about that. What we do want, though, is we want to specify a time zone, because the time that we're passing in depends on what the chart is interpreting or using as its time zone. So if you live in China or Europe or the East Coast of the United States or the West Coast of the United States, right, the time could be different. So we need to also specify not only what time we want to look for, but also what time zone that's going to be in. So you'll notice over here that we have a 1 out of 2. So there are two different versions of this function. And we're going to look at the other one. So time here gives us same time frame, gives us a session, but now it's asking for a time zone. So how do we put that in? It shows right here, and it gives you an example. America, New York, right? That is kind of the default for the markets. So again, notice that it uses quotation marks because it requires a string as an input. It says string. So we're going to type America/New York. Spelling and capitalization absolutely matter, so you do need to do it exactly the way that it is here in order for it to work. So we're now looking at the current chart's time frame. Is it in the window? Is the current bar on this time frame in this window according to this time zone? So what it's going to do is it's going to either give us back the current time or it's going to give us NA. We just want to know whether it's in the window or not. So what we're going to look for here is in the case where this is actually NA, right, where it's not inside the window. We basically want to know that. So the way you can test that is by typing NA, right, and then closing all this inside of the parentheses. In other words, it's going to check and see, it's going to say true or false. This value is NA, right? It's not a number. So in the case where we're outside of the window, it's going to say that is NA, and that means that we are actually we're outside of the window, right? So if it's NA, then we want to keep it false. The only time we want to turn it true is if it's not NA, when it's a real value, when we are actually inside this window. So we can add one more thing onto this if statement and say, if not NA, right? If this value that comes back is not NA, if it's not false, right? Then we can type in window equals true. So this is how we find out if we're inside of this session in this particular time zone. So let's update the chart so we can save our progress. Of course, there's nothing to see yet on here, and we'll go ahead and fix that. All right, so now that we have a way to detect whether we're in the window or not, we don't really have a way to see that quite yet. So one thing that we can do here is we can specify a color that we want to use in order to show that we're in the window. So it doesn't, we don't want to use something too bold, too crazy, but we do want to make sure that it is obvious where the window starts and where the window ends. So we'll leave that up to the user in this case of what color they want to use as a background color to kind of indicate that the window is open or closed. So what we're going to do is use color, and we will do color code, and we're going to input a color, of course, and we want the default value to be something like maybe color.new. We're going to specify, because we don't want a bold color, we want to adjust that transparency, so we'll do color white, and we'll set that to something like 90. So it's just kind of a slightly milky kind of background to show that we're in the window. And then of course we want the title, and we'll call it the background color, or we'll call it the window color, maybe better. So window color, and then down here we don't really need to plot the close at this point. We're not going to really follow anything like that. So a better visual for us to include in here is a new thing that we haven't done yet, which is called BG color, right? This method allows you to change the background color of the chart at certain times. So it's going to take in a color, right, that you want to use depending on the situation. So we are going to need a core logic though, right? We want to use color code, and we need a new variable. So we'll call this color background color, and that will be NA. We'll start with just NA, that way it doesn't color anything in the background to begin with, it just leaves it alone. But if we want to change it, we can just change it here, background color. So in the event that we detect that we are inside the window, we want to not only change this variable, but we also want to change the background color to the color code, right? So instead of using color code down here, we'll use background color, right? So that way, when we test to see if we're inside the window or not, right, it initializes to don't color anything, and the only time we are going to color something is when we change this because we are inside the window. So we'll take a look on the chart and see how that is. And you can see now, starting at 9:30 and ending at 15:55, right, which this is a 5-minute bar, so it closes at 1600. So as soon as we get past 1600, it stops coloring the background. So now we have an easy visual way of seeing that we are inside of the window. Perfect. Now that we have a way to tell if we're inside the window or not, and we have a visual representation of that, the next thing we need functionally for this script is some kind of anchor price, the price that all the other lines are going to be compared to. So this will require a new variable, and that variable we'll call, it's going to be a float, right, because this is a value that could be a decimal. It's going to be basically the asset's value. So we'll call this the anchor price, and we are going to default that to NA. We don't need any particular price to start with, and this anchor price is something that we don't want to change. We want this to stay the same all the time, and we don't have to want to reset it every single bar, because it's always going to be the same value until we want it to change. Until we specify that we want a different value for the anchor price, we want it to stay the same. So this is a new concept that we haven't really talked about yet, and the way that you can make sure that this is not a series, right? So this is going to be, if you hover over it, it's a simple float, right? And we can change that to be a var, right? So if we put var, that means that this is not going to change anymore in the way that this one changes. It's a series color, right? This one is a series bool. So that means that it has a different value for every bar, and it defaults back to this value on every bar unless you change it. So in this case, this is going to stay the same until we change it. So it will be NA until we, somewhere in the core logic, change that price. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to add in a nested if-then statement. So under this statement, so if it turns out that we are inside the window, we want to do something. So in fact, let's make this a separate function. So if we are in the window, then we want to do something. We want to do several things, really, but the first thing that we want to do is we want to check and see if we are not in the window, if this is the first bar where we're in the window, so that we don't do this every single time. We don't need to change the anchor price every single time that we're in the window. We only need to do it in the very beginning of the window. So the way we can do that is to put if in window 1, right? And this is how you access previous values in a series. So you'll notice this is a series bool, right? When you just call it the way that it is, it's basically the same as saying window 0, right? The current bar. The number inside of these brackets tells you how many bars ago you want to access, right? In this case, we want to access 1 bar into the past. So we want to compare if we're in the window right now, but if in the window in the last bar we were not in it, right? Meaning this is the first bar where we're actually inside the window, then we want to set the anchor price to the open, right? Whatever the opening price of this bar is, we're just going to set that as the anchor price. That way, for the rest of this window, this is going to be the anchor price. We don't need to run this code anymore. We don't need to reset the anchor price anymore. We can just do it right there. So as it is right now, we obviously still won't be able to see anything on the chart in terms of the anchor price. We need one more thing, which is going to be a line. Again, we don't want this line to change every single bar. We don't want to have to specify every single bar how to draw this line. So what we're going to do is we're going to say a var line, and we'll call it the anchor line. Also initialize this to NA. We don't need to specify anything about the line just yet. We just need it to exist. So in here, we will do anchor line, and then we're going to make a new line. So line.new is the method for creating a new line, and you have two main ways of drawing a line. So I like this second way because it tells you the x and y coordinates of the first point and the x and y coordinates of the second point. In other words, where should this line start and where should it end? It can be a diagonal, it can be horizontal, it can be vertical really if you want it to be. In this case, we want horizontal lines. So we're going to use bar index, right? This is an integer that tells you the, basically it's the number of the particular bar that you're on right now. So the first bar is numbered 0, and then depending on how many bars your particular subscription level supports, right, you could get up to maybe even 40,000. So it doesn't really matter though. What we need to know is what's the current bar number, and that's going to be our x, like our x point, right, the x-axis point for where we're going to start drawing this line on this bar. And then y1, where on the price line do we want to set this, and we want to put that to our anchor price, right? So similarly, we need the other side of the line. Where do we want to draw this to? For now, we can just use those exact same values. Actually, you know what? Let's add maybe 5, right? We'll add 5, so we're drawing it 5 bars into the future right now with this anchor line. So when we update the script, we should see that the line is, it's really hard to see, but it is there, right? So here's the first bar of our window, here's the opening price, and it draws it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bars into the future. All right, working great so far. So the anchor price is working properly, the line is being drawn properly, but what we don't have is we don't have this line extending all the way across to the other side of the window, which we definitely want, because if we want to be able to keep track of where this line is, we definitely want it to extend for the entire window. So how do we do that? Well, let's go into the script, and we're going to think about what we want to happen. We want the line to continue across as long as we're in the window, but we don't want it to keep going past the window. So we need to look in our logic here and say, if we're in the window, right? So we do want our code to be inside of this if-then statement. If we're not in the window, if we were not in the window previously though, do this. We don't want it to be inside of this if-then, right? Otherwise it only happens on the first bar. So what we need to do is we're going to push enter, and we're going to make sure that we're in line with this one. We're not under it, right? We're under this one. So it's a little bit tricky sometimes to kind of wrap your head around that in the beginning about how these if-then statements work. Since there is no actual then statement, it relies completely on the indentation level to determine where this is going to be run. So we want it to be indented from this level, but not indented from that level. So it needs to be in line here. So we say, if we're in the window, as long as we're in the window, what we want to do is we want to extend this anchor line to the right. So what we can do here is say anchor line dot set x2, right? So we're going to access this variable, the line, and we're going to change one of the values, right? The particular value we want to change is the x2 value, right? This is the one that tells how far is this line going to extend. We don't care about x1 because we know where we want it to start. We don't care about y1 or y2 because we want it to be a horizontal line. We don't want to change those values. All we want to change is x2. And what do we want to change it to? Well, we want to use bar index so that whatever the bar number is that we're on currently inside of this window, we just want to extend the line to go to that bar. So at this point, when we click publish, we should see that this line goes all the way across the window. Let's check. And we do. So here's our anchor price line, and it does go all the way across the window, and it does not extend beyond the window. Working as intended. Perfect. So now that we have our anchor price and line established, we have our window established. Now what we're going to need is we're going to need this indicator to draw our grid levels above and below this line so that we know where to buy and sell. And this is going to be a little more involved than some of the other snippets of code because this is going to take a few extra things. The first thing that we are going to want is when we look in here, we're going to want both a price and a line that goes with it, similar to the way that we did here. So we now want to look at a custom type. Remember I spoke earlier about making a custom type where you can save several different variables that kind of lump together into an object. I use the example of a dog. If you wanted to create an object of a dog, you could give it all kinds of different characteristics and store them as a dog. So here what we want is we want a grid level. So we're going to customize, we're going to create a custom type, and we're going to call that type grid level. And now we're going to specify what is a grid level. What kinds of things does a grid level contain? Well, the first thing that it contains is a float, and that's going to be the price. The other thing that we want it to have is a line, and we'll call that ln, right? Because if you use the word line, it actually it's already used and it has a definition, so we don't want to use that same thing. So we'll just abbreviate it as ln. So now that we have our grid level type, we can declare a variable. So in this case, we are using an anchor price and an anchor line here, right? So now instead of using these separately, we can just call it as a grid level. So we can say var grid level, and we'll call that the anchor equals. And what we're going to have to do is create a new grid level. So we initialize this as a new, grid level dot new. Then you need to construct your grid level. So you use these parentheses to specify the two things that go into making a grid level, and that includes price and line. So we are going to use NA, right? Just like we did here. But now we don't need these values anymore because we've wrapped them into one object. This is an anchor object. So what we're going to do here is, instead of saying anchor price, we're going to say anchor dot, and then we're going to access price. So you can see how now we're using this variable, anchor dot price, and then we'll do anchor dot ln, and we'll need to change our variables to reflect this new. And when you see these red squigglies, that means you're referencing something that doesn't exist inside the script. So it detects that this is going to cause an error. It doesn't know what anchor price is. You need to change all these to say anchor dot ln. And now, just to verify that everything's working properly with our new grid level object, you can see it still is working just the way that it did before we change this, but by using this grid level object, we're going to unlock some other functionality that's going to work make things a lot easier for us, a lot more dynamic as well in the script. So now that we have our custom type working as intended, what we're going to need as well is we're going to need a whole bunch of these levels. Depending on how many the user determines that they want to use, we're going to want to draw a bunch of these levels. We don't want to lock the user into any particular number of levels, which would happen if we were hard coding all this in. So one of the things that we're going to need to know from the user is how many levels that they want. So we're going to need an integer, and this is going to be called grid count, and we'll have them input an integer. We'll default this to something like 5, right? And then we'll call this grid count. And one more thing that we can kind of put in here just to make sure that the user understands what they're putting in, you have a tooltip option. So if you say tooltip equals, you can kind of explain what this variable is so that when they hover their mouse over it, you can kind of get an idea of what it's asking for. So this is going to be the number of grid lines above and below the anchor price. So now you can update the chart, take a look in the settings and see how that looks. So you see a grid count, there's the tooltip here, and it tells you when you hover over it the number of grid lines above and below the anchor price, right? So should be pretty clear from that description. So we go back in here, and the other thing that we're going to need in here is going to be the distance between each grid. So how far do you want this, how much space do you want in between each line? So that is going to have to be a float, right? Because it can be a decimal number. And this will be called grid space. Input float. And let's default that to 0.001, right? 0.1%, right? Most instruments don't move as a percentage very far. You could also put this as a hard-coded price, like a certain number of ticks or points or whatever. I like to use percentages just because it kind of keeps things fairly consistent over time, where percentages scale along with the price of an asset, and usually the higher the price of the asset, the bigger that these movements get as well. So using percentages is my best practice. That's what I like to do. So then I'll give it a title and call it the grid space. And again, we'll put a tooltip in there so the user can know that the percent distance between each grid level. Okay? So now that we have our grid count and our grid space, we can start kind of constructing our grid system and specifying how many there are going to be and how far apart they're going to be. We'll save our work. Making good progress. All right, so let's go ahead and dive back into our editor and start building out the grid level, the system, the whole grid. So one thing that we're going to want now is we want a whole bunch of different grid levels. We want to save them together kind of as a group. And there are a couple different ways you can do that. You can use lists or arrays. And one good thing about pinescript, in my opinion, is that their arrays are much more flexible than some other languages. So it's easy to manage an array, to kind of add things, remove things, rearrange the arrays, and do all kinds of mathematical functions on them. I think that pinescript did a really good job, actually, in this regard of making their arrays very useful. So what we're not going to want is an array that has to change every single bar, right? So we're going to specify that this is a variable, right? That this is a var, so that way it does not change on every bar. We set it once, and then we never have to set it again until we change something about it. So this is going to be an array, and the syntax for establishing an array is that you have to use these pointy brackets, and then you specify what type of thing is in this array. So in this case, it's a grid level. So we have an array of grid levels. That's like just basically a whole collection of grid levels that are all saved into one object. So we'll call this, very creatively, grid levels. And just like we did here, we need to initialize this level. So we will say this is a array.new. And what type of array is it? Well, again, it's a grid level array. And we can just use the empty brackets, but we do, or the parentheses. We do need, though, to have those parentheses, otherwise we'll get an error because array.new is actually a method. It doesn't have to take in any arguments, though, but you do need to specify that it's a method by putting the parentheses in here. So now that we have our variable for the array, one thing that we'll want to do, kind of almost the first thing that we want to do as we start this script. As soon as the script starts running, the first thing we want it to do is to create this object. And then we never want it to do that again. We want it only at the very beginning of the script, initialize this array, and then don't do it anymore. So the way you can do that is in pinescript, there is a condition called bar state. And bar state tells you some different options about like where is this bar in relation to history, or what is this bar doing. So you see that there are several different bools played in here that are either true or false, right? So is confirmed, is first, is history, is last. So if this is the first bar, right, is first will be true. If this is bar number 1, actually number 0 because it's zero-based system. So if the bar index is 0, that's the only time that this script or that this code is going to run. So that's what we want. You also have is last, is new. These are for different kind of situations that you might run into. For us, we want is first. If bar state is first equals true, equals, right? That's how you test to see if it's true. If bar state is first is true, then what we want to do is to set up this grid system. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to need to create a loop. And a loop will basically continue to do the same code over and over again until the loop is over, until it meets a certain condition. So the way that you initialize a loop is saying for, and for refers to a kind of a certain number of times that it's going to go through this loop. So you have to use some kind of variable to determine whether the loop has completed if you've gone through enough loops or not yet. So usually you'll start with I equals 0, and then you'll say to a certain number. In this case, what we want is we want to continue making new levels until we get to the count, right, that the user specified. So we're going to say grid count. Now, the problem with this is that if you start on 0 and you go to grid count and they say 5, you're actually going to end up with 6 different grid levels, because it's going to go through this loop 6 times because it's starting on 0. 0 is the first one that it does. So we actually want to do grid count minus 1. We want to do 1 less than this. That way we end up with actually exactly 5. And once we get into this loop, it's going to do all the code that's under here, that's indented under the for loop. It's going to do that 5 times at this point with this setting. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to create a new grid level. So we'll say grid level equals grid level dot new. And we do need to specify a couple things, right? Price and line. But we can initialize both of those as NA, just like we did up here. So we have a new grid level. In fact, let's specify that. Use our good coding habits. Grid level. Then we are going to So now that we have created our array, what we want to do is to populate it, right? Because right now it's empty. All we did was just pass in this empty method. We didn't actually put anything into this array. We just created kind of a container that currently has nothing in it. So what we want to do is we want to fill it up with a certain number of grids, like different levels, that are spaced a certain distance apart. And we only want to do this once. We don't want to do this over and over again on every bar, because once it's created, we don't need to create it again. We might need to change the values depending on the window and where the anchor price is, but that doesn't require recreating the entire array. We just need to adjust some of the variables inside of that array. So what we want to do is we want to, on the very first bar of this script, when it runs, we want to set up and populate the array, and then we never want to do it again. So the way that we do that is by accessing a variable called bar state. So bar state tells you some different conditions that the current bar is under. So let's take a look. So if we say bar state dot, and then you can see the drop down with all the different options. So you have several different options here. You can look and see, is it first? Is it last? Is it new? Is it confirmed? Basically, is this the very beginning of the bar? Is this the very last thing of that bar? Is it history? Is it real time? So all these different variables. The one we're looking for is first. And what this is saying is, if the current bar that we're on is the very first bar, we only want to do this one time. And we need to put equals true. And then we can go ahead and get started on actually populating this array. Now, in order to populate this array according to the user's specifications using the grid count and grid space variables, we're going to need to use something called a for loop. So the way that a for loop works is that you basically have a group of lines of code that it runs a specified number of times. And the way that you specify the number of times is by declaring for, and then you have some kind of variable, usually using the lowercase I as the variable. That's kind of the customary etiquette for this kind of code. And this usually starts at 0 and then runs to some other number. And in this case, what is the number that we want it to run to? Well, for each time that we run through this code, we're going to be creating a grid level, and we want it to stop creating levels when we get to the grid count. So we're going to pass in the grid count variable. And the one issue with doing it this particular way is that if you go from 0 to grid count, you're going to go from 0 to 5, which means actually you're going to have 6 different levels, which is not what the user wants. They want 5 levels. So you have basically two options. You can either initialize I to a different value than 0, or you can subtract 1 from grid count to get yourself the correct number. Usually I is instantiated to, or is initialized to 0, and that's for a good reason. A lot of things in code are 0 based, meaning that you start with the value 0, and changing I to something else is can be a little bit problematic, and it can add a little bit of more complexity to code than is necessary. So really it's just easier to subtract 1 from grid count. That way you end up with the right number of loops. So what are we going to do inside of this loop? Well, as I said, we're going to need to create a certain number of levels. So every time that we run through a script, we're going to create a new level. And this does not need to be complicated. Just like we did here, we created the anchor level and just initialized it to nothing. So we can do that again. We can say grid level, and we'll just call this a grid level, lowercase. That way we can keep it clean, knowing that this is an example of a grid level. And then we'll just do grid level.new, just like we did above, initializing both the price and the line to NA, because they don't need to have values right now. We're just creating the containers. So we have the container of the array, and then we have the container for the level as well, which we can come back and edit every time in the window when we start a new window. So we have our grid level, and then we are going to push that grid level we're going to add it into this bucket, the array. So we need to say grid levels dot push, and what push does is it adds the value of the element inside of these parentheses into the end of the array. So the array it starts at 0 right now, so we push something in, that goes on 0, we push something else in, that goes at the first index, and so on and so forth. So we're going to push in a new value, and what do we want to push in? Well, we want to push in this thing that we just created, this grid level. So we should be, according to this logic, we should be doing this 5 times. So we have no idea how many times, because there's nothing on the chart to tell us that that has happened 5 times. There's nothing visual to look at. So there is something we can do, though, to kind of peek under the hood a little bit at this. And we'll talk about that in a second. So how do we do it? How do we peek under the hood? There's a function called log, right? And most languages have this. Most platforms have this, a way to look at the code and to log different information. So Pine Editor makes this pretty simple. You just use log dot, and then you have error warning info. In this case, we just want some information. We just want to look under the hood and see what's going on. So what do we want to log? This is going to tell us some kind of information that we want to know. In this case, we want to know, did it create the right number of elements? Did it push enough items into this array so that we know that it's doing what it's supposed to do? So one of the things we can do is say grid levels dot, and this is an array, so you can get all kinds of information about this array, or you can do different methods for it. In this case, what we want is we want to know the size of this array, meaning how many things are in this array. So grid levels.size returns an integer, and that tells you how many things are in it. However, log.info only works with strings, right? So it can't report back a number. It can only report back a string. So what we need to do is change grid levels.size, which is an integer, into a string. And the way we do that is by using the string method. So str stands for string, and then we want to convert something to a string that used to be something else. So we enclose this whole thing in the parentheses of toString. So what it's doing is it's calculating grid levels.size, it's giving back a number, and then it's converting it into a string, which then we can log as information. So we click update on chart, and now we just need to look at the logs, which if you go to the top right, you have these this ellipse, right, for the more. You click on that, and you can see Pine logs. So you click on Pine logs, and this pulls up the log guide. And what happened is it logged every single loop. What it did was it updated the size. It reported back the current size every time we went through a loop. So the first time we got 1, then 2, 3, 4, 5, and then it stopped. So we know that the array, the grid levels array, now has 5 items in it, which is exactly what we wanted. So far, so good. So now that we've peeked under the hood and we've confirmed that the code is working as intended, right, that the loop is producing the correct number of values and pushing them into the array, we don't really need this log info anymore, so we can either comment that out with control/, or you can just delete it. I'm just going to leave it for now. And what we want to do next is to get into the window and make sure that we are reassigning these values to actual values. Right now they're at NA, and as we did with the anchor price, at the beginning of the window, on the very first bar of the window, we changed the value. So we assigned it a new value for the price, and we assigned a new line to actually create a line. So we want to do something similar for each of these levels. So what we're going to need to do is another for loop inside of this if statement. So making sure that you have 2 indentations so that you're underneath this if statement, you'll start with another for I equals 0 to grid count. So we want to run through all of these values again, and then indenting one more time, making sure that we're specifying the values for the for loop. So what we want to do is to get the elements from this array. We don't want to create new elements like we did up here. We want to pull the existing elements and change their values. So the way to do that is with a get function. So we're going to call up the grid levels array, and we'll put dot, and we need to use get. And that's how you're going to retrieve a value from that array. In this case, we're going to just follow the i's. This is why the 0 base is important for I. When you initialize it to 0, you're going to get the I value, the item that's in the I spot of that array. In this case, the 0 spot. So this is the first item in the array. Then we will go to the next item in the loop. I will equal 1, and then it'll equal 2, and 3, and 4, until we get to the end of the loops, right? The maximum number. So grid levels dot get I. So we need to save this as a variable. So we'll call that grid levels equals, and then we're going to pull it up. So now we've saved it and stored it in this value, which now we can access. So we're going to use grid level dot price, and we want to reassign this to something else. We want to change the price number from NA to something else. And what do we want it to be? Well, we need to calculate the value that this should have. So first thing is we want to reference the anchor price, because we want to be a certain distance away from the anchor price. So we say anchor.price, and we want to be above that price by a certain distance. So we need to add a value. Because this is a percentage value, we need to multiply it by the anchor price. So we say anchor price times this grid space value. So this gives us a certain distance, right? In this case, we're just one distance away, or we're calculating one distance. But in future ones, we want that to be maybe multiple distances away, right? A maximum of even 5 distances away. So we need to multiply this by one more number to make sure that we know how many steps away do we want to be. Well, we want to be I steps away. Not 0 though, because we want it to be 1 step is the minimum. So we need to do I plus 1. That way, on the first iteration, we're 1 step away. Then on the second iteration, we're 2 steps away, 3 steps away, so on and so forth. This way, we're going to calculate our price accurately, and we can come over here to then also draw our line .ln, and it's going to be basically the same exact function here, right? Line.new. We're going to use the bar index just like we did with the anchor price. The difference is we're not going to use the anchor price in this case. We're going to use this grid levels price. So we do grid level.price. We do the bar index again. We'll add 5 just to make sure that it's working properly when we can see it on the chart. If you leave it to just bar index, you won't even see it on the chart. You need to extend it a little bit just for spot checking that everything's working. So grid level.price. So just like we did up here, we're just doing the same thing except inside of a loop for every single value. So now when we click update, we should see 5 lines equally spaced above the anchor price. So we click there, check it, and there we are. We've got our anchor price that's extending all the way across, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that are equally spaced apart. We can even kind of measure and see it is indeed 0.1% between each one. So everything's working perfectly. Now what we don't see on this chart is any of the lower levels, right? So we have all the upper levels, all the additions onto the anchor, but we don't have anything that's subtracting and looking at the lower levels. So how do we fix that? Well, it's actually fairly simple. We're just going to go back into our script and we will see what we did here. When we created all of these items originally on the first bar of this script, we created a new grid level, and then we pushed it into our array. So what we want to do is just basically, every time we would just want to do that again. We want to do that twice. For every time we run through this, we want to add 2 levels instead of 1. So literally all we have to do is copy and paste this code and run it again. We do need to specify that this is going to be a separate grid level. So we need to give it another name instead of naming it the exact same. So we'll call this a lower grid level. We'll use this as upper just to keep it clear in our code what we're doing. And of course we need to update our names here, upper grid level, lower grid level. So now we should see when we uncomment this, we should be able to check in our log and see that instead of going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the log, we should see 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 to verify that we have 10 elements. We end up with 2 times 5, 10 elements instead of just 1 in our thing. So take a look in the Pine logs. Oh, gotta update the chart. And you see 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So now we're confirmed that we do have the correct number of items in our array now, and we can move on to updating them and giving them actual values that we can plot on the chart. So how do we update these values for the negative lines? Well, it's actually fairly simple, just like we did up here, where we copied and pasted and just adjusted a few things to make sure that we're addressing the upper and lower grid levels. We'll need to do the same thing down here. So we'll just copy and paste our levels here, and we will make sure that we have everything indented properly. So notice that, of course, we have 2 examples of the exact same script. So we'll do the same thing that we did here, where we're going to verify, or we're going to clarify, rather, our variables to make sure that they're clear, so it's easy when we come back into this code later that we understand what's happening. So just like we did up here, we're using upper and lower. So we'll say upper, and everywhere that we use the word grid level, we'll just add on upper in front of it to specify that we are working on the upper grid level. And down here, we will use lower grid level. Doing the same thing, we're going to just update all of our variables to have the correct syntax or the correct naming conventions. So the only thing left now is that we're going to be doing the same thing twice. We're just calling it 2 different things, right? We are creating we are getting the same exact level on the same index, which is not what we want. What we want is to get another different one. So right now, this one goes I equals 0, then 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, and then the loop stops. So we never get to those upper levels of the indices. So what we can do is, for the lower grid levels, we can just adjust which one we're getting. And we can offset that by adding to this I value the grid count. That way, on the first iteration, I equals 0 plus grid count, which is 5. So we're starting on the 5th element of the array. This one ends on the 4th element. And then we move forward into 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. So the lower grid level should access elements 5 through 9 in this loop, and the upper ones should access elements 0 through 4. Now, one last thing that we need to change, of course, is that the price is still being calculated the same way. This one is adding on incrementally higher levels, whereas this one we want to go lower. So rather than adding, all we need to do is change this to subtracting. And we should see when we click Update on Chart and we take a look over there, we should see 5 equally spaced levels going to the downside now as well. So let's check. And there it is. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we can verify that they are the correct distance away, 10 or 0.1%. So everything is working as intended. So now that we have all of our levels on the screen, we can see that these lines are being drawn only 5 bars in, right? Because that is what we specified in our script. We basically, at this point, we've only initialized these lines, and we haven't gone back and extended them the way that we did with the anchor line. So of course we want all these lines to extend all the way across. So let's go into the chart or into the script and see how we can do that. In the anchor line, what we did is on the first bar we initialized it, and then any other time besides the first bar of the window, for the rest of the window, what we do is every single bar we extend the x2 coordinate to be the current bar index. So every time there's a new bar, we're extending and extending and moving that line further over. And we want to do that for these as well. So all these other lines should also be extended in that same way. So what we need to do, make sure, of course, that we are indented properly. We want to be under the in window, but we don't want to be inside of the if the in window inside the first bar, right? We want this to be all the other bars. So what we're going to do is we're going to run through another for loop, just like we did before. I equals 0, 2, and we need to decide what is the maximum value that we want this to do. How many times do we want to loop through it? In this case, what we want to do is we're going to use the actual size of the grid levels, just like we did up here. We're going to use this variable, grid levels size -1. That way we know that this is 10, like there are 10 elements in here, and we want to access each one of those elements and then extend its line. So we want to start on 0 and end on 9. So what we do is just like we did here, we're going to get that grid level. Oops, let me do it correctly. And we'll call it grid level equals, and we'll use our get function, grid levels dot get. And which one do we want? We want the I element. Since we're going to go all the way from 0 to 9, we don't need to do anything else fancy here. We can just go straight through the whole array, and we're going to use the grid level dot ln dot set x2, just like we did up here, set x2, and we're going to set it to what? Bar index. That way every bar we're extending it to the current bar. So now when we click update on chart, we should see all of the lines extend all the way across. And they do. So far so good. So as it stands right now, this script is basically the functionality is all done, but the aesthetics still aren't quite there. Notice how it's kind of difficult to tell where the center line is. You kind of gotta estimate it somewhere in here, maybe here. It's not super clear. It's not very intuitive, and the visual cues are just not very strong. I like to have very clear visual cues for these indicators, so I want to make this midline really stand out, and I want to make sure that we're distinguishing between the higher levels where you're supposed to be selling and the lower levels where you're supposed to be buying. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we can do. So inside of the editor, we can go ahead and find the anchor line where we create it. This is where we specify the settings for the line. And just like we've done in other videos, we can add in the color parameter and set this to color.white. I like white because it's neutral. It just kind of is in the middle. And let's also make the width a little thicker so that it stands out. So let's update that on the chart. And now very clear where we have this midline. Now, other people may not agree with me. They may not like the color of that line. And when you go into the settings, there's no real way for you to change how these lines look. That's because we've coded this in a different way that pinescript doesn't allow you to go in there and change those settings. So unless we change something, basically the user is going to be stuck with blue lines that are one width, and they're going to have this white line that's 3 wide. And so that's not ideal. Let's go ahead and give the user some aesthetic freedom. So going back into the script, we'll need to add in a couple more variables. So we need a color, and we'll call that the upper color is an input.color. We'll call that the default. Let's default this to color.red, because on the upper levels you should be looking for selling. You should be looking for prices to come back down. And then let's give it an informative title. We'll call it the upper level color. Upper levels color. And then we'll do something similar for the lower levels. So instead of upper, we'll just call this lower, change it to green, and change the title to lower levels color. So now we need to plug these variables in as we initialize the lines, and we can do that here. Upper grid level color equals upper color, and lower color equals lower color. And now when we update it on the chart, of course, we get the default colors of red and green, but the user can come into the inputs and they can change the color themselves. Maybe they prefer something like orange and blue or something like that. So now they have more control over what this looks like. So at this point, it's looking pretty good, and I'm pretty pleased with the way that this is shaping up. So now just to recap kind of how this indicator can be useful, you can see on this particular day the was particularly well suited for this type of trading style. So you have a very wild swing up and then all the way back down to where it started. This is almost the ideal condition for this kind of indicator. Of course, this doesn't happen every day, but you can see how it works. So here, right off the bat, we have a break below of this level, and then it comes right back up, hits this level and that level. So that's two wins, right? Bought here, sold here, and then sold there. So you've got two wins. Then you come down, you hit this again. Then you come back up and you win. You buy here, come back up, sell, buy. So you can see how every time that we're bouncing between these levels, you're racking up another win. And in this particular case, there's nothing left open at the end of the day because it did come all the way full circle and it did not leave any open positions. So this actually worked out really, really well. That's just a coincidence. I did not cherry pick this. I actually recorded that. I'm recording this today, Monday, August 25th, right? You see that today's is 26th. This is just yesterday's price action. So it just coincidentally worked out that this was like almost the picture perfect day for this. So I'm pretty happy with that. And that concludes this video series.